The 18th century in France was marked by the deepening and exacerbation of internal cleavages. In one sense, the absolutist state was extended under the successors of Louis XIV, Louis XV, and the XVI. But in perhaps a more important sense, the state was undermined. And not only because these succeeding monarchs were not particularly charismatic leaders, but also because the wider context was changing too dramatically for perhaps any absolutist monarch to adjust. Firstly, the 18th century was a period of extraordinary economic growth, as the mercantilist policies stimulated the growth of domestic mining and domestic industry. During much of this century, France was the leading industrial power in the world. Britain's time, you might remember here, would not come until the next century, the 19th. Mercantilism contributed to the emergence of middle classes that were skeptical of these traditional privileges held by the clergy and by the nobility, especially the freedom from taxes on their lands. A second issue or dimension. The French state administration was growing enormously, both in order to carry out wars and to facilitate the international trade. Accordingly, the French administrative bureaucracy itself, the organizational structure, grew significantly. For example, establishment of a Department of Bridges and Highways, the so-called Corps des Ponts et Chaussées, gave France the best highway system in the world, or road system, facilitating lots of trade with other countries across Europe. The increasing size of the French administrative bureaucracy had the effect of increasing its distance in terms of authority from the crown. In other words, during this 18th century, the state was becoming too big for a monarch to rule personally, as Louis XIV had done earlier. Thirdly, this monarchy experienced many difficulties in carrying out the affairs of state. Not only was it expensive to carry on wars, but the French were losing. For example, at the end of the so-called 7 Years' War in 1763, France lost nearly all of its vast colonial empire in America and also in India. These wars were expensive. But the crown, to support these wars, could not get access to the wealth of the nobility. Severe poverty among the commoners undermined the legitimacy of the contract, the implicit contract that they had with their sovereign. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, and I introduce a topic that we'll spend considerable time here, advocates for a new way of thinking about human beings, about God, and about society was emerging. Under absolutism, a person was defined, an individual person, everyday person, was defined according to his or her position in relationship to the sovereign. One's identity was actually incorporated into the body of the sovereign. When the sovereign served by divine right, then the sovereign's administrative management basically amounted to God's active participation or management of everyday life. The death of a monarch, accordingly, marked a dangerous time because the absolutist state depended upon the leadership of a legitimate and legitimated monarch. Only with successful replacement by a new monarch could the crisis of state be averted. Also, as the historian Michel Foucault outlines, a crime in an absolutist state constituted a direct, almost personal offense against the sovereign, rather than some internal failure of discipline by an individual person. So punishment, for example, was not an exercise of rehabilitation as it is today, or paying for a misdeed, but really constituted a direct act of revenge by the sovereign, an act of revenge that would serve as a warning to others not to offend the sovereign in a similar way.